Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On November the 17th, 1979, what started as a routine caving trip to an easy West Virginia cave turned into an absolute nightmare when an inexperienced group with a dangerously overconfident leader were putting their lives on the line. Whiting's Neck Cave sits in the Panhandle area of West Virginia, and by 1979, it had earned a solid reputation among explorers as an easy, beginner-friendly cave system. On this particular November day, 4 experienced spelunkers from the Baltimore Grotto arrived at Whiting's Neck Cave. Richard Treater, George Nichols, Mike Lurs, and Steve Jensen were all seasoned cave explorers who knew proper techniques and safety protocols. They had brought along 4 novices who were getting their first real caving experience, and they were planning a conservative trip through the easier sections of the cave. The group entered through the back entrance and made their way to the main feature of the cave, a 45-foot, 13.7-meter, inclined drop that required proper rope work to descend safely. The Baltimore Grotto members rigged a hand line on the left side of the drop. All 8 members of their group went down without incident, exactly as planned for a beginner-friendly trip. But then, a second group arrived at the top of the drop, and things immediately started to go wrong. This second group was led by someone Steve Jensen would later describe as a military type A personality. Someone who seemed knowledgeable about caving and rock climbing, who projected confidence and authority, and who apparently convinced about 15 people in their late teens to follow him into the cave. Of these 15 young people, 2 were deaf, which added another layer of communication difficulty to an already problematic situation. Before this second group could even get organized, a third group arrived at the drop. The entrance area was now becoming crowded with explorers of wildly varying experience levels, and the potential for chaos was building rapidly. The leader of the second group took one look at the hand line the Baltimore Grotto had rigged on the left side, and apparently decided it wasn't good enough for his group. Instead of using the safe, conservative setup that experienced ones had installed, he rigged his own line right in the middle of the drop, directly over the section where there was a 10-foot, 3-meter section of completely free vertical drop, followed by 35 feet, 10.6 meters, of steep descent at about an 80-degree angle. The Baltimore Grotto members offered to let the second group use their hand line, twice. They explained that their setup was safer and more appropriate for inexperienced groups. But the military-type leader refused both times, apparently convinced that his way was better. Then the real disaster began. Members of the second group started body rappelling down the drop using the poorly positioned rope their leader had rigged. Body rappelling is a technique where you wrap the rope around your body to create friction and control your descent, but it requires practice, proper technique, and ideally should be done on appropriate terrain. Using it on a drop with a 10-foot free fall section and a steep 80-degree slope below was asking for trouble, especially with inexperienced teenagers. Steve Jensen and the other Baltimore Grotto members watched in growing horror as it became immediately obvious that the members of the second group had no idea what they were doing. Their inexperience wasn't just apparent, it was glaringly dangerous. Jensen yelled down to Mike Lurs, who had gone ahead into the next section, to get Richard Treater. They needed the most experienced members of their group present because this situation was deteriorating fast, and someone was going to get seriously hurt or killed. In the next few minutes, the situation went from bad to catastrophic. One deaf girl fell 20 feet, 6 meters, down the drop, tumbling and bouncing off the rock face before landing hard at the bottom. Miraculously, she wasn't seriously injured, but she became briefly hysterical from the trauma and terror of the fall. Before anyone could properly respond to that incident, another person fell, this time dropping 10 feet, 3 meters, before hitting the slope. Again, through sheer luck, there were no serious injuries, but the person was shaken and panicked. But the accidents didn't stop there. 2 other members of the inexperienced group had made it partway down the poorly rigged rope before they became completely stranded. They had descended to a point where they couldn't safely continue down, but they also couldn't climb back up. They were stuck on the steep slope, clinging to the rope in the middle of the drop, terrified and unable to move in either direction. The Baltimore Grotto members watched this unfolding disaster with a mixture of horror and anger. This military-type leader had refused their help, ignored their safer rope setup, and was now directly responsible for multiple falls and people stranded on a dangerous drop. And there were still more people from his group waiting at the top to attempt the same descent. The experienced guys made a decision. Things had gone far enough. Someone was going to die if they didn't intervene immediately and forcefully. Steve Jensen and his companions confronted the leader of the second group and gave him a direct order. Leave the cave now and take your group with you. This wasn't a suggestion or a polite request. It was a command backed by the authority that comes from actually knowing what you're doing in a dangerous environment. But first, they had to deal with the immediate crisis. 2 young people were stranded on the rope, unable to move, and more members of the group were scattered at various points below the drop, some injured and all traumatized by what they had just experienced. The Baltimore Grotto members organized a proper rescue operation. They worked systematically to get everyone who had made it to the bottom of the drop stabilized and accounted for. Then they turned their attention to the 2 people stranded on the rope in the middle of the drop. Getting these 2 down safely wasn't a matter of talking them through proper technique or giving them instructions. They were too panicked, too inexperienced, and in too precarious a position for that to work. The experienced ones had to resort to brute force, literally hauling them up by the rope using pure muscle power. This was exhausting, dangerous work. They had to pull the stranded individuals up a steep, irregular slope while making sure they didn't lose control of the rope or cause additional injuries. But through careful coordination and significant physical effort, they managed to get both stranded people back to the top of the drop. Once everyone was accounted for and the immediate danger was resolved, the Baltimore Grotto members made sure the inexperienced group, and especially their overconfident leader, understood that they were done. They were exiting the cave immediately, and they were not to attempt any more rope work or exploration. The entire group made their way out of Whiting's Neck Cave, with the experienced ones essentially shepherding the inexperienced group to ensure no one else got hurt. The military-type leader was probably embarrassed and angry at being overruled, while the teenagers he'd brought were traumatized and shaken by the falls and chaos they had experienced. Steve Jensen and the Baltimore Grotto members believed they had lived up to their responsibilities by intervening when they did. They violated the inexperienced leader's autonomy and freedom to run his own trip, but they potentially saved lives by doing so. The novices in that group, at least most of them, probably didn't fully understand what they were getting into when they followed this overconfident leader into the cave. In 2005, an experienced cave diver entered a remote British cave system to continue exploration work that had been abandoned 30 years earlier. What he found in those dark, silty passages would trap him in a nightmare scenario where every movement made his situation worse, and time itself became his enemy. Low Birkwidth Cave is located in the Yorkshire Dales of England, part of the extensive limestone cave systems that run through this region of northern Britain. The cave had been partially explored back in the 1970s by pioneering cave divers who had pushed into the flooded passages as far as their equipment and techniques would allow them at the time. But cave diving technology and techniques had advanced significantly in the 3 decades since those original explorations. What had been the absolute limit of possibility in the 1970s was now considered achievable with modern equipment and training. This made caves like Low Birkwidth attractive targets for experienced divers who wanted to push beyond where the previous generations had stopped. Colin Pryor was exactly the kind of diver qualified to take on this challenge. He was an experienced cave diver who understood the unique dangers of exploring flooded underground passages. He knew about silt outs, entanglement hazards, navigation challenges, and all the other risks that make cave diving one of the most dangerous activities on Earth. Pryor had undertaken a project to revisit Low Birkwidth Cave and extend the exploration beyond. The sections of Low Birkwidth that Pryor was diving through were characterized by low, narrow passages filled with fine silt. The passages are so tight that divers often have to remove their equipment and push it ahead of them to squeeze through. In the 1970s, when the original divers pushed into Low Birkwidth, they laid guideline through the passages they explored. But when those divers finished their exploration and decided they had reached the limit of what was possible, they didn't remove all their guidelines. When cave divers explore new passages, they lay guidelines behind them as they penetrate deeper into the system. This line serves as their lifeline back to open water. In zero visibility conditions, following the line is the only way to navigate back to safety. In the 1970s, some sections were left in place, either because they were too difficult to recover or because the divers thought they might be useful for future explorations. Over the course of 30 years, this old line had deteriorated, become loose, and was now floating freely in the flooded passages like deadly underwater spider webs. Pryor entered the water and began his dive, following proper cave diving protocols. He was laying his own guideline as he penetrated deeper into the system, creating a safe route back to the entrance. He navigated through the tight, low passages, carefully managing his movements to avoid stirring up the fine silt that covered every surface. As Pryor pushed deeper into the cave system, he began encountering the old guideline from the 1970s explorations. At first, this wasn't necessarily alarming. It actually confirmed that he was following the same route the original divers had taken. But what Pryor didn't immediately realize was just how degraded and dangerous this old line had become. The guideline from the 1970s had been floating in the flooded passages for 3 decades. The constant water flow, the chemical processes in the cave water, and simply the passage of time had weakened the line and caused it to separate from many of its anchor points. Instead of being a taut, secure line attached to the cave walls, it had become loose and floating, drifting in the current like seaweed. As Pryor continued deeper into the system, he began to encounter more and more of this loose, deteriorated line. It was everywhere in the passage, draped across the route, hanging from the ceiling, coiled on the floor. In the confined space of the low passage, it was almost impossible to avoid contact with the old line. As he maneuvered through a particularly tight section, the old guideline wrapped around his equipment. Maybe it caught on his tank valve, or his dive light, or one of the clips on his harness. In the confined space and limited visibility, Pryor didn't even notice it at first. But as he continued moving forward, the entanglement got worse. The old line wrapped around more of his equipment, creating loops and tangles that became increasingly complex with every movement he made. Pryor realized he was caught, and he immediately stopped moving forward to assess his situation. In cave diving, entanglement is one of the most feared hazards because it can quickly become a death trap. The more you struggle against the entanglement, the worse it typically gets. But Pryor was an experienced diver who understood this. Pryor reached for his knife, which all cave divers carry for exactly this kind of situation. He began carefully cutting away the old guideline that had wrapped around his equipment, trying to free himself without creating a silt out, or damaging his own freshly laid guideline that was his route back to safety. But here's where the terrible reality of his situation became clear. The old line wasn't just wrapped around one piece of equipment. It was tangled around multiple points on his body and gear, creating a complex web of entanglement in the confined passage. Every time Pryor cut away one section of line, he would discover more tangles elsewhere. And all of this was happening in a low, narrow passage where he couldn't easily see his own equipment, couldn't move freely to reach all the entanglement points, and was constantly at risk of stirring up the fine silt that would reduce visibility to zero. As Pryor worked to free himself, his air supply steadily depleted with each breath. Cave divers follow the rule of thirds. Use 1/3 of your air to penetrate into the cave, 1/3 to exit, and keep 1/3 in reserve for emergencies. But Pryor's emergency was consuming air faster than he had planned, and he was still deep in the cave system. Pryor realized at some point that he was in serious trouble. The entanglement was more complex than he initially thought. His air supply was running lower than it should be for his position in the cave, and he was still firmly trapped by the old guideline. The silt was stirring up because of all his movement, and now he couldn't even see anything. Visibility was zero. Pryor was working largely by feel, trying to locate the entangling lines with his hands and cut them away with his knife while suspended in a narrow underwater passage with zero visibility. He intensified his efforts to cut himself free, working faster. But the old line was everywhere. Every time he freed himself from one tangle, his movements would cause him to become caught in another section of the degraded guideline that was floating throughout the passage. As his air supply continued to drop, Pryor was forced to make increasingly desperate decisions. Every option had serious risks, and the clock was ticking down with every breath he took from his rapidly depleting air supply. The final minutes of Colin Pryor's life would have been absolutely terrifying. He was an experienced diver who understood exactly what was happening to him. He knew that his air was running out. He knew that he was still trapped, and he knew that time had run out for any chance of freeing himself and reaching safety. As his air supply finally ran out completely, Pryor would have taken his last breaths from his tank, feeling the increasing resistance as the regulator struggled to deliver air from the nearly empty cylinder. Then there would have been nothing. Just the desperate, instinctive attempt to breathe underwater that accomplishes nothing except filling the lungs with water. Colin Pryor drowned in that low, silty passage in Low Birkwidth Cave, trapped by old guidelines that had been left behind by divers 30 years earlier. His body was eventually recovered by other experienced cave divers who entered the system to bring him back to the surface. But the recovery operation was extremely dangerous and difficult due to the same tight, silty conditions that had claimed Pryor's life. They saw his body floating, tangled in the aged line, with cuts at different places. The sight told a horrific story. In that haunting stillness, the cave revealed the final moments of a life lost far beneath the surface.